Hello, hello. We just had our customary conversation about the role of AI in kicking out our recordings. So recording was kicked in, out, forward, something. At any rate, it's Biweeklycast episode number 53. The hosts are still here. I'm Dima Malenko.
I'm Slava, and before we jump to our today's topic, there is a follow-up and a theme corner.
All right, and follow-up. Yeah, I'm still a little bit baffled that I'm the only one who tries to bring up to our conversations.
It's like
but that's
300 episodes in, and you're still puzzled by that.
Yeah, I should learn better about that. Sure, but I do have some follow-up, and I'm super thankful for you for bringing that topic that we discussed last time, this model of chain of results or results chain. It became such a useful part of my vocabulary when I kind of went into kind of brainstorming sessions or discussions, when I sensed that if folks maybe are making a little bit of a shortcut between implying that a particular action is going to produce some kind of impact, I know how to call it. And I said, like, wait a minute, let's deconstruct this chain. Like, what's the immediate effect of the thing that we are going to do? And how do we expect that to translate into the thing that we are looking for? And it was really, really useful. Really intend for this to become a part of my regular toolbox.
Yay. Like, I think this is something that wouldn't really harm any manager to read. So if you missed our previous episode, please go back and check it out.
Right. And do you happen to know where this thing comes from? Because you sent me the slide deck that explains the concept. It does have some slightly obscure references to where these ideas might be coming from. Do you know any better who is the originator?
I don't know the author. I know it comes from the field of business analysis. And the slide deck you were reading is the L&D adaptation of business analysis tools. That's why it's like really vague in terms of the origins, because it's not normally used in L&D. It was just an interpretation of BA tools.
Yep, that probably would be one of the next steps for me to try to dig up the roots of that concept and maybe learn a little bit more about that.
I'm glad it worked.
Right. Then to the theme corner, I still have not decided or defined or committed to some sort of theme for a year, because it's a little bit of a kind of period that turns out to be the shift of gears in multiple aspects of my life. Like there are some changes at work that we are going through. And it also seems to be, from multiple points of view, a nice moment for kind of restart or switch of gears, like however you call it. But still, there is a lot of ambiguity, and I'm not too certain about some things. And I decided, all right, I'll take it easy, and I will only choose a theme for upcoming period. And for now, it was kind of for January, and I called it a January of putting one foot in front of the other to prevent myself maybe from overthinking stuff and just figuring out and focusing on what can be done right now, even with incomplete information and so on and so forth, and just do the next step, do the next step, do the next step. That seems to be working fine. It does help me to not get sucked into or stuck in kind of fantasizing or wish casting, and just instead I focus on acquiring the information, connections that would be required for moving forward.
Have you considered taking a gap year? Like a year without a theme?
No. Well, I wanted to say like it might be a possibility, but I did not consider that. And I think that this year I will still need to be kind of more focused even than I was previously. And I feel themes help me with that.
Yeah. I mean, but you could do like 4 quarterly themes.
That's a good point. Good point. I'll think it over.
I mean, you don't have to give up themes in general, but you could do half a year or 6 months of something.
That's a good
That's one thing that kind of sometimes slows me down when I think like, am I sure that I'm ready to commit for a year for this thing? Like sometimes I can see the perspective of 3-6 months forward,
Mhm.
but then it's kind of harder, and I'm trying to guess what is going to be next. And this is where I kind of slow down and spend a lot of time. But fortunately for me now, when I have the triennial year and seasons, it's kind of more flexible.
That's a good point. One other thing I wanted to share in the theme corner was that we discussed this previously, how journaling is helpful, and I'm kind of trying to once again kind of be more systematic with it. And you may remember that at some point I said that, like, for me, abandoning journaling is a sign that I learned to interpret as like things are starting going kind of astray. I need to kind of maybe slow down and do something about that. And I figured that there is one more thing for me that has similar value as being for signaling that things may be not right. Because generally, I think when I'm in a good mood, in good spirits, and good like high levels of energy, I'm very open and keen on talking to people, kind of collaborating with them and figuring stuff out. But then when things are not as well, maybe I feel like I'm getting behind on stuff. I like, no, like I don't want to talk to anyone. I just need to get this stuff done. And this, looking back, I think like those are the periods where things are not getting better; they are getting worse by me trying to focus and push stuff out of the door. So I'm now also trying to keep my eye on that aspect of my progress of work as well.
That's interesting because it's been the holiday season, and some people in my environment took time off, like
Right.
week, 2 weeks, and some of them coming back said like, I think it was good time off because I don't hate people anymore. Like, I feel optimistic, and I would like to share some experiences and thoughts, and they qualify it as criterion of good rest.
Good point. I can resonate with that a little bit, but I also found that, once again, looking back, that while I also get similar vibes coming back from my vacations, I also found that it is possible that I will then relatively quickly kind of degrade into a situation, or no, I don't want to talk to anyone, like even a week after 2 weeks vacation, which is surprising, which may be saying something uh, different. But I now tend to, at least in my individual case, to connect that more with my kind of internal emotional or energetical or state or something along those lines.
So, summing it up, you told about the January, but January is about to run out. Is it going to be February of this thing as well?
Yeah, it could be. Like I will follow your steps and maybe continuing those things, and until I feel like there is like new goal, new setup.
That was one other thing that we were discussing with some colleagues who do strategic session facilitations, that companies that do planning like in spring and in summer usually do it way more meaningfully and diligently because they're not overwhelmed with all the other stuff that happens by the end of the year. So maybe if your year shifts a bit and starts like every March or April, it wouldn't harm.
That's a good idea. Well, some situations, artificial kind of boundaries and artificial deadlines might be helpful and kind of have a little bit of a motivational kick. In some other situations, they might be harmful. That's a good point.
I've been living for a year with a theme that started in September. It's still a year. It's like 12 months from September to September, right?
And all moments are equal, right? It's not necessarily given that the year starts on 0000 on January 1st of a given year, right?
True.
It's just an arbitrary moment.
It's physics or math or whatever it is, numbers.
Yes, sign.
All right. So, quite a scary topic for today, which is named Undead Documents. And seems like zombie or.
Yes, a little bit of that. So I'm borrowing this terminology from an article, or rather blog post, by one software engineers called Doug. I'm trying to check, like Doug Turnbull. So he has a blog, and kind of the way I come across this article and this topic has two elements in that. And the article by the way, is called Fighting Undead Documentation. It's kind of an older one by him. So the way how I come across this whole thing was that in this new year, I wanted to also systematize a little bit the intake of information that comes into my head and focus more on more thoughtful kind of things, give priority to books and maybe to well-crafted articles rather than like news or something like YouTube videos and stuff like that. And one element of that was to revitalizing my habit of checking the Hacker News. You may have heard of this site, but I don't check the Hacker News, the site itself. Instead, I'm subscribed to a newsletter that every week sends a list of links to the most popular stuff on Hacker News categorized by different categories. So I'm kind of saying, like, all right, I will check what this newsletter links to and then see if there is something interesting for me. I'll put it into my reader app and read. And this is how I come across this particular article. And it's also related to one of the things I'm working on at work, where based on experiences with past projects, I want to document kind of several more generic patterns of how we can go about solving one particular problem or implementing a particular functionality that spans across multiple systems, and it requires them to be configured or kind of connected in a particular way to achieve a particular result so that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And I was contemplating what is the best way to organize and produce this documentation for it to be useful, because it has a little bit of a conundrum that in order to understand the value of this thing, need to have had made those mistakes that will lead you to understanding of that pattern. But if you had made those mistakes, you don't need the pattern. You will figure out it on your own. Like, it's too late for you to read this documentation. I was looking like, what would be like, how can I make this thing useful? Because due to certain kind of dynamics that's going on, it's not entirely possible to institute or everyone does it this way. People may come across this document and follow the pattern. They may come across this document and say like, I don't feel like it, I'll do my own thing. Or they may just miss and just go ahead and do their own thing. And this what in general led me to thinking about documentation, how it's useful, how it's not useful, how it rottens, and how it might be even misleading or even harmful.
So, would you define an undead document for me in one sentence?
So undead, like for the purposes of this particular discussion, maybe I would define the undead document is a document that looks real. It has the details. It's kind of persuasive. You by the looks of it, you have every inclination to trust this document. But in fact, because it already is outdated, or it was created some time ago, not updated, is not true to reality, and the actual details that are presented there, they are not exactly helpful, or at times they can even be misleading because they describe some old state of the world. And kind of a document would be a document that's somewhere on the brink between being useful in that it saves you time to understand what's going on, to being wasteful of your time because it leads you the wrong path trying to deal with some.
And we are not talking about some minor changes like people names change, channels names in the policy or something, but you could be reading 2/3 of the document that seems right, and then just read something that is not entirely true for the last third, and you don't know it when you start.
Right. Or it can be something even like if it contains some instructions or guidelines on how to do XYZ, you start doing that XYZ, and then by the time of doing Z, it turns out that this cannot be done the way it's described in the document, or should not be done in the way it's described in the document, and you are back to square one, figuring out how to do the thing you wanted to do.
All right, that makes sense.
So with that, I fully acknowledge that I might have a bit of a bias because it feels like in software and software engineering and software systems, the pace of change is rather high, right? We, as software engineers, we don't necessarily do a good job of documenting our systems upfront. And then by the virtue of that and through other circumstances, those systems tend to change rather quickly. And this makes whatever documentation that might be in existence obsolete relatively quickly. And this would be the kind of situations or the circumstances where this challenge of undead documentation kind of arises. And I wonder if in your line of work you have seen or experienced anything similar like that. Does this resonate? And if so, how, or maybe why not?
I would say that two things that totally come to my mind when you talk about this are policies. Like when people write a policy of doing whatever, let's say in Savvy case of passing the client through the lane of sales manager, account manager, some experts, trainers, like many things change in this process, like the way what people should do, who should do this kind of work, the organizational structure, the places where it takes stuff, designs, and many other things. And the policy is usually updated only after a few mishaps are occurring and we see that there is like something that like there is nobody thinks like, all right, I'm changing this process and I should note it down in this and that documents. People just change the process, they write a little update in the chat about it, and that's it. And when things don't go right, they start thinking, why did they go wrong? So policies is the one thing, and the other is the manuals, like when people explain, for example, how the functionality of our testing system works. Yes, it did work like this 6 months ago, and then there was an update for the browser, and then something else has changed, and then they've changed the UI slightly, and it doesn't look the way it looks like right now. It's like this little triangular, and the menu is hidden under this little thing, which was not in the video. And I totally buy that, like, you cannot re-record all the manuals and all the things right after every update, because that would take quite a lot of time. But when I don't use a system daily, and I find the older video or the older manual, I always have a bit of a doubt whether I will see what is in this video on the actual live server.
Well, that's actually such a good example, right? Because when you're dealing with something that is not necessarily your core expertise or kind of core of your day-to-day activities, and you still need to do something with someone else's systems or with someone else's process, you appreciate so much if they give you very detailed step-by-step instruction on how to do stuff, so that you don't need to think too much. You're just like a robot, like following the steps. But also this is the downfall, because if the system moves a little bit to the side from this instruction, not understanding the kind of principles and the mechanics of the entire process, you're almost lost, because the instructions do not match the reality and you have zero knowledge or understanding on how to resolve that. How we might deal with that? I think one thing that I'm trying to do is at least send the signal to folks that when you're looking at this document, kind of please understand that it might be old. And to do that, in every doc I create, somewhere in the near the title, I try to inject the date when the doc was created or when it was updated. I have even a kind of keyboard shortcut where I type a couple of letters and it will put the current date, but it only goes to kind of maybe signal to raise awareness that, hey, kind of beware, it might be an outdated dog. But do you have you tried anything? Do you have thoughts on how this might be solved?
My first thought here is to consider how many people are actually impacted by this kind of thing. Because if that's a manual for teachers in Savvy, there are dozens of people who are going to use it, and we don't know when or how often, but the potential is quite high. If it's a financial doc, there are 4 people in our team, and it's okay to go and ask if something has changed, like our accounting system or something along those lines. Our finance managers work with it on a daily basis. I come there once a month. Some other team members come there once a year to check some kind of data. I would measure the pace of updates by the number of people who are potentially impacted by the incorrect data or insufficient data in this document. And when the number grows, like if you make a document for a wider audience, We try making it live on Notion, not some Google Docs or something that is rarely updated. Like Notion is a live thing, and whenever a person clicks on their link, they will come to the latest version just automatically. While with some other file systems, it works quite differently, and you have to know like whether it's like 1.1.1.6 something that got updated by 1.1.1.7 something. And I'm not sure that there is a recipe, because this bureaucracy at this level just doesn't make much sense, because updating every doc for every change that happens would require extra two managers or two people just documenting everything that all other people are doing, because we do a lot, like we change a lot. Right now we're merging two systems, and it doesn't make sense to document anything before we merge them, because we're in the transition right now. We are going to be in the state of transition for 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And I think only when we complete this kind of transition, it makes sense to update most of the manuals and documents to, like, we are at this new stage or the new level where most of the significant changes are done. And now we can show users how it works. But before that, it seems bureaucratic and unnecessary, because it basically impacts just the development team, and they know it because they're working on it. Like, they see all the open tickets and all the changes.
Yeah, I think it's in general kind of the challenge here, right? Striking the balance about the level of detail that you put into the documentation, including the level of detail being zero, like no documentation at all, versus the effort that is required to maintain that, versus the potential waste of time when the necessary information is not readily available, and figuring out how to thread the needle between all of those.
And I think one last thing here is the way people approach these kind of documents quite often. Because I think it was Arthur, my colleague, who told me about the use case documents, like when they basically show you the way you approach something, like they show you the scenario of doing something. And then there are these descriptive Wikipedia articles that just have every detail of what is there in that system. And that's totally incomprehensive. Like, I can't go through this kind of document unless I'm an architect or like very interested engineer. But I come there for a specific function. Like, I would like to perform action X here. And not like, I can understand why designers need to document their work and how they have to. Designers, I mean, like developers, like people who create the system, would want to collaborate and keep the documentation if new people join, or if they have to delegate some kind of work, like, so they could show what was their intention and how the system was built. But choosing between doing something and documenting something is really hard, because I think doing seems very intuitive. Like, let's just do all these 5 things and then document. But then when these 5 things are done, there are other 5 things that have to be done. And then there are 5 more things that have to be done. And documenting is always a lower priority than doing, because, like, well, you do something, you see the results, you write something, it's just another paragraph in that text that was already there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I agree that very often, almost maybe always, the documentation takes a backseat for any other kinds of work, and this is how I think that I've been trying that, maybe not too successfully, but in cases when it was successful, it was successful. It's a little bit of tautology there, to make, at least in engineering or software kind of projects, to make the documentation part of the product itself, because then when this product is useful, people use it and make changes. So kind of it is being maintained through being at the center of someone's attention. And if documentation is also right there, there is a greater chance of this documentation being maintained. Like if there is a wizard, like set of steps that you need to take users from through, I would prefer not to have a document that describes like those steps, but embed pieces of that documents into the screens themselves, describing, oh, like we we are now going to go through a 3-step process. These are the fields that need to be filled, that this is what those fields mean, rather than saying like, this is the form that you need to fill in. Here's the link to the document that describes how to do that. And guess what? The document gets outdated the next week, and kind of putting this documentation, making the documentation as almost as first class of a citizen in the overall product as it possibly can. Kind of in cases where I was able to implement that, was helpful to keep that documentation more undead than in some other cases.
I think I can't emphasize to this issue just because in our team we have this type of channels that every team has an incoming request open channel. Like if I'm working with our R&D team and I can't figure something out, I just text my problem there and people guide me. Like, let's say I picked the wrong menu. Like I found the old link, I checked something, it doesn't click. I just post the screenshot and ask like, guys, what am I doing wrong? And somebody would guide me there. They would either say like, no, that's on our site, like we don't have the right manual, let me show you how it works, or they will just send me the document that is updated, because I might have used my browser history instead of just going to the appropriate place, because that's also one of the tricks, that we don't always go to the proper storage. We can just lazily try to find the previous thing that we were working with.
Do you think that level of support that you're being given might be a function of you being a CEO of a company?
No, it's open channels. Like anybody from any team could come to these kind of channels to talk. Like we have such things for requests for BizDev, for R&D team, for managers. Like whenever somebody faces an issue. Plus, many of the docs, not all, but many that we work, they have the owner, and you could contact the owner if something is not right, and the owner would also take you through this process.
I would imagine that maybe in kind of bigger teams, bigger companies, it might be an issue, because if you are an owner of the document and you are constantly bombarded with questions about how to do X, hopefully that would make you to update that document.
Yeah, but that's the sign that something is not right. And
right.
But I think that here it probably shouldn't be a person, it should be a role. Like I would say that because people change all the time and roles are pretty much there.
Right. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess like one of the questions I had for us to discuss, maybe to pick your brain a little bit about how you worked on the development of the system that you're working on. And I guess you told us a little bit about that already. Are there any other interesting stories related to documentation in your experience being, I don't know, like a client or customer for software development team?
I was working with a project manager who had quite an interesting practice related to updating documents. They agreed with their team that every 15th day of the month, or the next business day if it's a weekend, the entire team spends their time updating stuff. Like they fill in the reports, they file some changes, they go through the documentation, they make the necessary updates, and they don't have meetings on the 15th day, like never ever. Even if it's a regular, like let's say this 15th day happens on Monday, like people have to move their regular Monday meetings to another day, just because like this is a no meeting day. And if they fail to update something, or some repercussions, but that's a different culture. And I wouldn't want to work in such team. But generally, I think that that's quite a healthy thing, like to know that on some regular basis. I'm not sure it should be done monthly for our team. Like in our case, it could be quarterly or even half a year, because we don't do that much of development. These are very few people who do that, and very few people who are impacted by changes. Generally, having a step that you find reasonable in the updates, and whatever it is, 2 weeks, month, season, half a year, just planning the time for this sort of activity probably seems reasonable. I'm not sure if it works in real life. Like I haven't seen this team doing that, but that's what I heard as a practice.
No, I think this is a good one. I think that it connects to my also notion about that in order for something to be kept up to date or maintained, it needs to be at the center of someone's attention, at least sometimes, right? if I have a car and I never drive it, of course it's going to get rusty and probably will stop functioning correctly. But if I'm driving it every day or every other week, I will notice things maybe getting slightly out of whack and then put some effort to fix them. And that happens just through the sheer fact that someone's looking at that stuff. Like this documentation days that you describe is a method, I guess, to force an attention to be paid to this particular area that otherwise might be overlooked or not prioritized in other day-to-day activities, which is it's a good thing.
And just in your experience, we can talk about everyone, but like, how was your documentation when you were an engineer? Like, how did you manage the scope of documents that you were responsible for?
That's a good question. I think I tried to make documents and documentation to be a kind of understandable by someone who doesn't have intimate connection to the area or doesn't work there day to day. I think like I always thought and still think that it's important to provide some sort of ramp for a person to get up to speed on what's going on, kind of describe like this system is doing XYZ, this is important because of that, and here is how the system actually does it and what it is connected to, because this is useful for outsiders. They can get oriented faster, but also when you stop working with that area for some time, of course you lose kind of working knowledge and working memory of that thing. It can be useful for yourself to get back up to speed, so that I would often write sections that are written in general language and introduce maybe some of the jargon that is used elsewhere. And I also try to put specific purpose of the document explicitly in the document itself, not to create impression that this document is something that it actually isn't. And I think that that's specifically applicable to some of the design documents, because after the system was designed, that's kind of a big system, it's out there, we rarely operate on the system as a whole. We develop new features, new something, new that, and a document that describes a particular feature, it is what it is. It's a document describing a particular feature, and it would be useful to call this out, so it does not say anything about the system at large or something like that, even though the title or something else might give someone that idea. No, like we are talking about this specific project where we changed this feature from being something to being something else, and kind of don't expect that you find more information about that. Kind of constrain and be specific about the purpose of the document.
And managerial wise, like, how often would you work on documentation? Like, saying you have a week of development, would you do it on weekly basis or on monthly basis? Or it would be like a stage, like you complete some kind of work and then after completion you document it?
It depends. At some point I was a little bit on the extreme end where I tried to document as much as I could kind of beforehand, almost to the extent that the have a when it comes to system documentation, have a documentation that you go through it, and the only next possible step is that you put that thing into the code. There is no more room to put any more kind of details or kind of any additional decisions that need to be made there are already there. Like you just need to translate that into the code. And then I kind of moved away from this because it feels like it's a little bit kind of impractical, because if you have a document at that level of detail, that's great. It may be all right. Everyone agrees with that. But what you have is a document, but it's not what you want to have. You want to have a working, functioning system, which means the code. And then I moved more to, all right, some sort of a middle ground, kind of describing upfront describing why we are doing it, what are the key principles, such that understanding that someone reading the code and kind of, I'm trying to jump to code at that point. So someone reading the code plus that documentation would understand why things are done in a specific way, almost to the extent I would consider it is a success that kind of reading the document and reading one part of the system, they would know how the other part is working, even though that there is no specific description of how that is.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure if it's too specific or too something.
You described a few approaches, and like if you talk in percents, like how many cases would you have when you were writing the documents when it felt right, yeah, or when you had to, like you basically gave two main use cases when you were doing that. Which of them was more frequent?
I would say that it's much more the latter one, kind of stop, like provide justification and key principles and then move on to actual stuff is like 80% or more of the work.
And it seems just like the way you described it, that it does refer to new stuff, like something that was created, but when it comes to changes, like there is something that impacts the previous editions or blog posts.
That is a good question, and I don't know that I have a good way of dealing with that. But yeah, the documentation that I would typically create would be describing that particular change. So it says like, oh, like we have this.
But then it comes to the question whether everyone reads that part of the
Right.
blog.
That's exactly the problem. Then, if someone new comes to the space, in order for them to understand what's going on, they have to go through a whole bunch of, like, back in the day, it was this, but then there were 150 updates, and you have to read the document about each of those updates to get a clear or more or less accurate picture of where the system is now. And this, I think, is kind of a big challenge for, at least for software projects, because updating that kind of documentation, like the generic system overview or description or design principles of the document, of design documents describing design principles of the systems, are often neglected part of engineering work. Not everyone is a fan of working on something like that, and it does create problem. And there is also a trap where you would think like, yeah, this is tiny change, right? It doesn't change what the system is doing too much or the way it operates too much. So it can be like, yeah, if you read the original documentation on the system, it gives you enough of a good idea about how the stuff works, but then changes accumulate and it's no longer true.
I also think that sometimes people don't even realize where the information about this feature is. Like our developers could be changing some functions and they can't even fully understand where these functions are mentioned or showed in our manuals and documents, because they're not exclusively the ones who create those.
Right.
It could be other team members who have already created something referring to this specific thing, and then you change the thing and you don't even know that it was referred by someone in another document.
Yep.
But it kind of makes me think that creating the perfect document is impossible just by common sense, that the time changes and things get outdated. And the problem is in the changing. Like if the doc was written incorrectly or incomprehensibly, you will get feedback, or someone will get feedback. There is negative feedback about it and somebody has to fix it. Or the system changes and then somebody has to fix it. So the issue here is not purely in the design or the approach or the style or the structure, but rather in the way people just deprioritize making these changes, and that it seems not as important as another kind of tasks. And then it eventually causes some misunderstanding and issues and mistakes and waste of time research and stuff.
I think you're definitely onto something with that. I do agree that discoverability in general is a huge problem for, especially for complex systems. Like when you change or add something, how do people know about that new thing or about that new change? And this would be the area where I think the system kind of design and development and whatever it might be need to go hand in hand with the documentation and sort of support one another and help, because sometimes like we do have a lot of documentation about kind of systems. Like recently I was making a payment and it was not going through. I decided I need to get support right for that, and of course naturally companies first send you to help articles, and those help articles, yes, I get it that you thought that it is useful to describe how to make transfers when there is like literally on the home screen of the app there is a big button called make transfer, and you need to click it and kind of fill in the details, and you have a page that describes how to do that. Like, who would need that? They can go to the app and they see it right there. And of course there was nothing about the problem I had, which had to do with the time it takes to clear for some payments to clear, and therefore they like transactions do not appear immediately and stuff like that. There was nothing about that in the documentation. But this would be the space where if someone said that, hey, you just made this transaction, we see it, it might not be reflected here because it takes some time for those things to appear in this particular list of transactions, it would be solved, right? Probably they know about that stuff, and maybe there were multiple people who had the similar problem. And this, I think, where if something is broken or not exactly optimal in the system, you may not necessarily be able to solve that with the documentation. And likewise, if the system is a little bit clunky, no matter how you structure, how perfect the documentation is, it can still be confusing. And of course, in an ideal world, both of those things should work together.
That makes sense. And I think that many people approach it quite formally, like that we need this support section just because everyone does that. And it's like with some pages on the website, and people put them because everyone puts them. Like there should be a page about our company. Like we don't care, you don't care, nobody cares, but there should be a page about that. So let's.
Google cares to put you on index.
So one specific targeted expert who cares about this page, but it's like a technical thing. It could have been hidden. Yeah, then that makes sense. But as I'm getting into this line of thinking, I started considering an option if like there should be a role responsible for this kind of like for technical documentation. And I remember that there is a position like tech writer or people who work with development teams that that's their main responsibility, like not to distract engineering teams from their purpose. Like they just go together. And the way I remember, it was not very helpful because like people who are not doing this kind of work, they still spend quite a lot of time interviewing people who do and double checking and rewriting, and it still doesn't fix it, right? There are still outdated documents, and seems like it's just like we should stop changing stuff. That's the only way.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I've seen multiple instances when there was this separate kind of role, a separate function to create or maintain documentation, both internal and for external users. And it is super difficult to get it right, because I think like my take on the difficulty of the challenge there is that it's difficult to put forward the incentive system that would drive this whole setup in the right direction. Because if a tech writers are its own separate function, you need to measure their effectiveness or productivity, whatever it might be, to set OKRs, and that can often lead to things like created X number of pages to describe something like that. But then, yeah, you do that, but then how do you measure quality of value of those pages being created? Yeah, and like, is it really helpful that we have those pages? Do they help users to do their thing? Yeah, documentation often becomes an afterthought in that kind of setup, which makes it even more difficult and challenging. Yeah, it almost feels like there has to be someone who kind of buys this whole idea of, no, documentation is important. It is part of the system. And if we have good or kind of better than average documentation, our system is going to be more successful. Our product is going to be more successful and impactful for the users, and kind of oscillate between improving system, improving documentation, and then back to improving system based on insights we get from improving documentation or providing support to users and so on.
I think that it turns into like a battle for attention, because basically, if we imagine an average employee, there are so many things that this person should care about.
Mm-hmm.
And it really does come to the fact who sells specific managerial practices better in the team. Just like a metaphor, like my dentist says I have to do this and that. Fitness coach says I have to do this and that. My massage therapist says I have to do this and that. My psychotherapist says I have to do this and that. Like, I don't have any more time for work because I have all these tips and recommendations how I should maintain my life to live happily. But like, there is no activity anymore because I have to perform all this kind of walks and talks and conversations and journaling and flossing and stretching after the workout and specific kind of procedures. And the same thing works in management. Like, if you write the proper agenda, the right invitations, build up expectations of people before the meeting, invest time into the proper follow-up, and then you do the same thing for 6 more meetings you had this week, that's all. Like, that's all your business time. Like, you did one good thing. Like, you prepared for the calls. If you did some extra work after these calls and you documented them, that's it. Like, that was your weekend. It's already wasted.
It's such a deep observations. I was thinking hard about how to respond to that, because it's indeed true, right? You sort of, everything is evolved onto itself. If you set a goal of, oh, like we need to have perfect documentation, perfect process, perfect this, perfect that, you can spend all the time in the world just on that particular thing, and you still need to kind of balance it with other things. You cannot spend all 100% of your time doing this. But I don't have any like super smart response to that, other than you probably at some point you would develop an intuitive feel about how to navigate those stuff. It's like riding a bicycle, right? You cannot explain how to ride a bicycle. One might say that you need to kind of pick up some speed, and then the momentum will carry you and you will not fall
Yeah,
over.
all these experts always say that. Like, my nutritionist, like, would say, like, you should feel what you should eat. Like, how many vegetables should I get? Like, just feel it. Your body will tell you.
Well, no, no. Why do you take us there? I think that there is a difference between someone saying you should feel it and you actually feeling that you feel it. I don't know. I think like somehow I feel that there is something kind of deeply philosophical and maybe at the same time kind of deeply physical to the world and how we navigate it in your statement. But I'm having a really hard time pinning that down, because it's like once again like riding bicycle, right? You can do that, but you cannot really explain it, right? And then when you can ride a bicycle, you can stretch it, right? You may keep balance on a bicycle even without moving anywhere, by just kind of adjusting your body ever so slightly, which might not be impossible, which would be impossible for a novice bike rider. So you learn to feel it.
Yeah. But then, like, you learn to feel it in a team with specific bicycle riders who have their
Mm-hmm.
style and their approach. And I think I have the answer to myself. Like, what's the solution
Nice.
here? Themes. Like, you should have the documentation theme. Like, it could be a week of documentation in your team. Just like advocate it. Like, make people do that. Like, sell them the idea of themes.
Right. No. That's totally right. Like, you, instead of saying we do this specific thing with documentation, we instead say, oh, we allocate this time to do whatever is
Improvements.
important or useful, or whatever we feel is important for documentation at that at that time and kind of bring everyone's attention to that. One other thing that I tried several times with respect to documentation, especially to the aspect of the documentation, of external documentation, let's say when like there are systems and that there are users who use it and to whom it might not be exactly obvious how the system operates and how to do stuff they want to do with that system, is to, I don't know, like how did I call it, like active or something, or actively responsive documentation, where if you get a question, kind of provide an answer to that question through documentation. Like someone asks how to do XYZ in this particular situation.
You
If
do
we,
not answer these people before you write a document, right?
right, yeah, the answer to that person should be, oh, here is the link, how you
How
do
does
that.
it impact the response time?
It shouldn't, right? Because if you were to answer that person, you would still need to write up how to do that.
Unless it's a new document that you have to
Right,
actually put
but then
together.
you would still need to write that up, and instead of responding them in a chat or in an email, you turn that into something that's publicly visible.
Unless your response is like, can we have a quick call and I'll show you everything?
Exactly. Right. And then that's exactly the problem or the challenge of this approach. It requires kind of discipline, right? You need to keep in mind that with this, you learn about the problems that users or kind of partners have. And while you want to help this specific individual, you also want to help all others who are going to come after
All right,
them.
there's just one issue with your approach. What if it's an edge case? Like it's just this specific guy who got that deep into this topic, and you're like confident no one else is going to look in this direction, and you have to draft like an entire document helping him navigate through this thing, knowing that like no one else cares, and that's not even our priority. Like we are not working in this direction.
In my defense, I would posit that before that person coming to you with that question, same rationale would have applied. You would not have written that document because you thought that no one was going to go there. It's such an edge case, no one is going to need that, and yet there is a living proof in front of you
Yeah,
who
but like
went
one
there.
one person's request doesn't equal like it's going to happen ever again. Like you can create a document that will ever be read once by this specific person, and that's it.
This is where you need to remember about the bicycle and feel it. You need to feel like how likely is it that,
Who will ride this path?
yes, exactly, yeah, of course, yeah, and this is exactly the challenge. And I think I would say that maybe we too often err on the side of, this is such a unique case, a special snowflake, let's just deal with it and not create the documentation or anything like that. And there is also a rule for that, which I haphazardly try to follow, is that maybe the first time, it is about automation, but I think it can be applicable to this case as well. Like the first time you do it yourself, the second time you make a note about this thing, and the third time you don't do it yourself, you sort of automate it out. So maybe the first time you answer the question, you answer the question. The second time you answer the question, you answer the question, but put a mental note. The third time you write a document and share it with the world.
Unless all three times happened in 5 minutes.
But then it's an indication, no, that the world needs the document. The world needs the document.
And bicycles.
And bicycles. It's interesting. We often start with some somewhat mundane and specific things, like the documents getting outdated, and then almost inevitably end up with a philosophical understanding of the universe and implications of complexity and connections in the world.
Like that's what you get when you invite two Aspen alumnus into a podcast episode.
Yeah, you get even more if all the episodes are those two Aspen alumni talking to one another about weird stuff. So I guess at this point we are going to talk about more weird and interesting stuff in the next episode in like 2 weeks or something.
Yeah, hopefully good weeks.
Good weeks.